What's up, rotters, and welcome back to the podcast that takes a deep dive into the best and worst horror films of the 80s and 90s. I'm Stevie, your VHS veteran. It's time to give a shout out to more of Brain Rot's wonderful patrons, and so I'd like to say a huge thank you and yas bitch to Matthew Bird, Alexandra Bamford, Matthew Taylor, Miriam Dornauer. Apologies if my pronunciation was dreadful then, Miriam. Nick Moffat, Ben Aslett, Miriam, Dave Morrow, and Mike P. Thank you so much for supporting the show. It means the world to me, honestly. I can't thank you enough. I'll be continuing our patron thank yous next week. If you'd like to join the Rotters Club, just go to patreon.com/Stevie's Brain Rot to sign up. Over there, Louise, Blaine, and I have just one Children of the Corn movie left to cover out of 11, 12? 30, I honestly can't remember. I think we've done 11, 12. Oh my gosh. Anyway, yeah, that final retrospective episode will be dropping soon over on Patreon. My God, what a slog. I truly think it is the worst franchise I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. So that's fun. But yeah, it's nearly over. But today, we are discussing the 1988 Ken Russell horror comedy, The Lair of the White Worm, starring Amanda Donahoe, Hugh Grant, and Peter Capaldi. This lesser-known gem is one hell of a ride, and it is unmistakably Ken Russell, particularly in the final act, with its dry humour, strong female lead, and seriously trippy visuals. This movie deserves its place in the cult section. And who better to talk all things cult horror with me than the hosts of the incredible cult movie podcast Midnight Mass, legendary drag queen Peaches Christ and friend of the pod Michael Varrati. Midnight Mass is a must-listen recommendation from me. Each episode, Peaches and Michael break down a legendary cult movie and have special guests join them. Sometimes the guest can be a superfan, sometimes it's the filmmaker or star of the movie in question themselves. It's nostalgic nectar, and yeah, make sure you check that out. Also, just to say, I must have been pretty tired when we recorded this, as I managed to record my audio through my headphones instead of my expensive mic, so apologies for me sounding like a distant robot at times. Is there any other kind of robot? But hey, it's still magic being able to have conversations with like-minded people across the world, so suck it up. Alright, let's get Serpentine. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you.
Hat trick. You're here for the third time.
Well, I'm thrilled to be back. I always love getting to come and talk movies with you. I feel like last time we got together, we talked about something overly serious, Pumpkinhead, which doesn't seem like it's a serious movie, but it definitely is. So I'm excited to dig into this slightly more wacky entry.
Yeah, and this time you brought company with you. So a huge brain rot welcome to Peaches Christ. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Oh, it's such an honor. It really is. It's an honor to have you both here together. You're such a great team, and honestly, your podcast Midnight Mass has become absolute essential weekly listening for me. And what I love about it so much is that your love for these cult movies is so deep, and it's really relatable. And not only do you have amazing guests and this incredibly intelligent analysis of these movies, but at the same time, you both kind of just completely geek out and fangirl, and it's really endearing, and it makes us, the listener, it feels like we've just all been to see the movie together and we're on our way home from the cinema, and it's that sort of excited chatter, and that's how it feels being on it. So it's just, I think it's wonderful.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think both Michael and I, there is this not just in the genre that we love, cult movies or horror, but just in the film fan universe, there is a certain kind of aloofness that comes with a lot of film fans that I actually find to be a turnoff. And it's like, no, I'm just a big kid who just loves these things, and I just want to share that excitement. I mean, all of Peaches Christ was built around sharing a love of cult cinema with audiences, whether it be in the form of a drag show or, whatever. And so with the podcast, I think both Michael and I, we maybe didn't ever articulate it, but it was definitely like an unspoken thing of like, we're going to be unapologetically dorky and just love these things. Yeah.
That's so nice because it's, often you do come at it from a sort of academic angle, but then you go,
Right.
oh my God, in that bit. And it's great.
Yeah.
It's just lovely the way I love how it just, the structure suddenly shifts and you don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, but you've talked a bit about Midnight Mass before on here, Michael. But Peaches, I'd love to ask you, what was the catalyst or the sort of moment that made you go, do you know what, fuck it, let's bring back Midnight Mass as a podcast?
The pandemic. I mean, it's that thing where I have been meaning to add certain things to my, I guess, media roster for years. But, after making All About Evil, which is the feature film I made.
That's just had release, right? Properly.
Yeah, I had a re-release.
Seven.
Yeah. Recently, I really just needed to like put money in the bank, but I wanted to do it like doing something I loved. And for any of you that have made independent films, like that's not the smartest way to put money in the bank. It's a lot of work and very little return often, which is fine. I love it, but so I got very involved in performing and then touring with shows that were successful and actually loving that and enjoying it, but it didn't make room for making another movie, creating a podcast, building a haunted attraction. So the nice thing was I had intentionally decided, okay, I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to do less performing, less touring, do the haunted attraction, and maybe someday I'll create a podcast version of Midnight Mass. And then I called Michael. I think maybe we were a little bit into the pandemic when I made the call, and that's why, really.
Yeah, very galvanizing, a pandemic.
Yes.
Especially for podcasts. It's almost like if you don't have a podcast post-pandemic, like, I mean, what were you doing?
Yeah. It's wonderful. And also, I think being a queer horror fan is it means being a member of the most kind of organic club, because I think most of us gravitated towards horror due to some sort of relatability in one way or another, and often we thought we were the only ones. And both queer people and horror fans were kind of demonized publicly during my youth, especially. I grew up during Thatcherism, where there was literally anti-gay propaganda publicly on television through Thatcher and her people, and then also through the video nasty scare in England.
Yeah.
So anyone who liked those sick horror films, were deviants. And so I was both. I was gay and a horror fan. And to me, they're one and the same. What was your both of you, your experience growing up as a queer horror fan, and where do they meet, if you know what I mean?
Well, I love that you said that it's an organic meeting, because in many ways I think that it is. I've always said that horror is a queer genre, and just because of the people who run the industry, the messaging kind of got shifted at some point. But horror, by definition, is a genre of otherness, and it's a genre of subversion. Well, queer people understand otherness, and for many, many, many years, and continuing to now, we are treated as a subversive element of society. So these are things that we connect to. And I've told the story of my origins many, many times. And so the Cliff Notes version of that is I had seen a double feature of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes and Return of the Killer Tomatoes on USA Up all night. And that was sort of a baptism for me, because I realized that there was an other kind of movie out there. This sort of like movie that my friends weren't talking about at school, or that they were not playing at the multiplex. And I was drawn into that idea of forbidden. And I think that even before I had a word for queer or like my own self, it was like I was drawn to the other. So it made sense that those two things would eventually intersect.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally relate to that. I think one of my ins was, or one of the moments I realized and everything made sense, was watching The Lost Boys when I was younger, and seeing, and how attractive it was seeing these people who were the outcasts, but they found each other. No one else in society liked them, or they were disregarded, but they had each other. And yeah, sure, they were killing people, but that was by the by. But I was like, that's the club I want to be in. And then there's that line when Michael first sees them attack all the sort of bikers around the fire pit and bites them, and then they turn to Michael and say, now you know what we are, now you know what you are. And my world went, wait, is this say? Is that what I think it's saying? And for me, that was, I think, the real moment when I went,
there's something here. This is horror is fucking queer. What about you, Peaches?
I definitely did not connect the dots until way later in life. I just didn't. I mean, I was raised so repressed in many ways, like as far as being in a suburban Catholic, going to Catholic school, kind of 80s sort of basic childhood, where even the concept of being gay was so foreign, or queer. I mean, I didn't even understand the concept of queerness, and I did understand a darkness around it because I was growing up Catholic, and so I was equating that form of sexuality with hell and deviancy. I love that you kind of described, us as being super deviants, right? We're double deviants in a way, and and I think a lot of queer people, whether you're attracted to horror or not, you are attracted. A lot of us are attracted to things that are subversive, transgressive. A different kind. Our pop music is different. Our movie tastes are different. Our sense of humor is different. And so growing up and seeing gayness equated with death and disease and it surrounding me, I think for a lot of us Gen Xers, our sexuality is infused with a level of darkness, thanks to AIDS, that does specifically speak to our generation. And so I've talked to much older gay men, especially, who came of age before AIDS, and I don't know that they have the same darkness that we do. And I do wonder, as an adult now, if AIDS helped push me towards a more horror world, or if that's just the way it was. I don't know. I'm not Sigmund Freud, so but I will say that my sense of sexuality was to deny it, and my sense of horror and the macabre and the absurd was to embrace it. So even though I was deeply closeted, I was obsessed with John Waters. I was obsessed with the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Like, everything I liked was queer, and I was obsessed with Fangoria magazine and horror movies. And I thought I was the only one. So it wasn't until way later that my brain, that I was able to go like, wait, this thing that I thought had nothing to do with my sexuality might have a lot to do with it. That was a revelation that continues to evolve over time. And the fact that Michael and I have a podcast where we talk about these connections pretty much every episode is hilarious to me, because in the early days of the physical manifestation of Midnight Mass, I used to talk about how not gay my event was. You know what I mean? Like, I thought I was, doing this sort of punk rock,
unironically,
non-sexuality based, celebration of cult movies, and realize now, like, holy shit, it's like the queerest thing ever,
Right.
But it makes sense, right? Because for a long time, as we alluded to, there was a cultural divide where, even though these things were intrinsically linked, the way the industry positioned it, the way the gatekeepers positioned it, was that there was a separation. If you look at something like A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which is inarguably super queer, even in its problematic way, the narrative at the time was absolutely not. And they had convinced swaths of the world that it was just a coincidence. And so it took a while for people to get to talk about this and to start unpack this thing that was always true.
And the fact that the heroes of my era were people that I could not see myself reflected in. Now I know much more. But Wes Craven and Romero and John Carpenter and the fans, the most popular fans, the special effects creators, Tom Savini, etc., they were all seemingly very straight, very masculine presenting white men who were at the top of this field. So I didn't see a place for me. Little did I know, when I was watching Hellraiser, who Clive Barker really was. I didn't, these are all revelations. I mean, God, I had the Child's Play poster on my wall. I loved Chucky. No idea about Don Mancini, because they weren't allowed to speak openly about who they were.
Nah.
So it is something that's evolved over time, and now as we enter this huge era of queer horror, quote unquote, which I think is so amazing and wonderful. I get to actually kind of be part of this journey, and I'm actually part of the revelation in some ways, because it's, for me, it's like a self-discovery. Like, oh my God, this is all interconnected. This is all linked, and it's
Totally.
fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you brought up the AIDS epidemic, because actually both queerness and horror for a long time have been in a state of recovery, in terms of perception from the others or the general person, because horror during the VHS boom, it turned into something else, and there was the video nasties, and there was some really awful stuff that really just blanketed horror as one thing, of this disgusting thing for deviance. And the same with the AIDS epidemic. We were seen differently, and we were all the same, and everything had to be underground, where we thrived. And it's now that suddenly it's taken a really long time. It's taken decades. People, you can't, God, every company wants a drag queen to represent them and be on the front cover selling their shit. And everyone wants to make a horror movie now, because suddenly they're respectable again, or they're getting applauded for once. So it's taken a really long time. But I mean, of course, we're not there yet, especially with the queerness. But it's been a fucking battle to get recognized and what's the opposite of repressed?
Well, free, just free.
Sure.
But no, it's interesting though, because we're talking about the AIDS epidemic and its impact, but it impacted horror too, and it's something that's not as discussed. But when you look at the Thatcher era and the Reagan era, even though the 80s, what we're celebrating today is an 80s horror movie made by someone who kind of works outside of what I'm about to say, but the culture was being molded by this ultra-conservative, let's return to morals, return to virtues, political movement. And we even see one of the great rules that Wes Craven baked into Scream that everyone likes to cite: if you have sex, you die. Well, that wasn't always true. That started to happen in the middle of the Reagan-Thatcher years during the AIDS crisis in 80s horror movies. If you look to the 70s Hammer horror films, there was free love, vampire ladies were banging vampire ladies, and then we get the shift. And that is directly influenced by what's going on, including AIDS.
So interesting. That is so interesting. And of course, you're completely right. It completely reflects that. Yes, but you mentioned, what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, this is definitely what I would call a cult film. But what to you is the stipulation for something? What constitutes a cult movie? What are the stipulations to make it one? Anyone? That's
definitely another definition or idea that for me continues to evolve. And so again, I think when I started Midnight Mass, the event, as Peaches Christ, which was centered around the public exhibition of cult movies and a celebration of cult movies back in 1998, my concept of what a cult movie was definitely evolved, and at the beginning, it was often something that was hard to find, something that was niche, something that was transgressive, that wouldn't be screened in a regular daytime hour and attract a crowd. These were things that needed to be seen at midnight because of all the deviancy and and so it was very specific to that. The first ever thing we did was Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, which to me is quintessentially cult, undeniably cult, and we did a lot of that first year movies like Female Trouble, and I think we might have done Evil Dead 2, and over the years, especially when I started to book and program movies like The Goonies, which were popular films that were easy to find, I realized that cult also could mean, or at least in my definition, that there are these films that you grow up worshiping as kids, you watch over and over and over again, and you love them so much, they become like a religion to you, that you need to go out and celebrate them with a room full of like-minded freaks. That was not a film type that was part of my original definition of cult movies, but certainly now I say, that's a cult movie too. maybe a different kind of cult movie. And so now it's like that thing where it's like, is it transgressive, and do people want to celebrate it, years after its release? And do they want to celebrate it with other cult members? Is it important to you to get together with people to share this love of this thing? And so, I think it's that combination of the transgressive quality matched with, the sort of actual cult quality. Is there an actual cult?
Yeah, right, an actual cult. It's interesting, isn't it? I think also for me, a big part of it is we weren't as connected back then. We couldn't chat to each other about this film. And quite often, a few times, I think I genuinely thought I had discovered this film.
Right.
And I assumed no one else in the world will have seen The Wizard starring Fred Savage. It's like, that was because that was on a shelf, and I don't think anyone had ever rented it apart from me. And it became like this secret film almost that only I knew. And so I think now that we're in a world where we're so connected and we know that so many other people love that fucking film, it's such an exciting, you get to relive that time. And I always think films, I never see films as quite doing something to us. I feel we leave something on the film itself the first time you see it. And how do I explain that? So when you go back to a film, that bit of you that you left on it is still there, and you experience it exactly the same. And that's why whenever I watch the Blair Witch Project, it will terrify me because of the first time I experienced it. I will go through the same emotions. It doesn't matter if it's 2:00 in the afternoon, broad daylight. And of course, of all the found footage that has come since then, some of them are absolutely scarier or more interesting, whatever. But if you weren't there, and you weren't there in 1999, you didn't see that film, it didn't do to you what it did to me, it won't have that effect on you. My boyfriend watched it. He was like, this is dreadful, And I feel like that's another element of cult, that you left a timestamp of you at that time on it, that you revisit every time you press play on that film.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. One of the things we talk about on Midnight Mass is the idea that cult films are movies you carry with you throughout your life. Right. And your relationship with them grows, and you just spoke to that. And I think that's true, because there are plenty of movies. We three here are movie watchers, voraciously, I assume. And there are plenty of movies during a given year I see, and I'm like, that was great. And then, I walk into the kitchen after the credits roll, and I probably will never think about it again. Whereas a cult film is a movie that kind of burrows in, and it's next thing you know, 10 years have passed, and I still am obsessed with that movie.
Yeah. What about this then? So, Lair of the White Worm, directed by the slightly talented Ken Russell. What is your relationship, both of you, with this movie? Have either of you read the Bram Stoker novel, which is loosely, I believe, based on, which I haven't read?
Okay, so I have not read it. And I am so glad we chose this movie for a number of reasons. One is that I kind of, it's been in the back of my head for a while. So, this fall, I'll present a new show that's called The Summoning. That's this immersive interactive horror show that I do at the Terror Vault. And I created a character with my creative collaborator, David, that's a woman that reveals herself after a Dance of the Seven Veils to be a serpent. And so at some point while talking about this character, I said, David, this is really like Lair of the White Worm. I wonder if Lair of the White Worm informed this idea in my head, but I hadn't seen the movie in 20 years. So rewatching it, yes, my idea, my quote-unquote genius idea, is completely stolen from Lair of the White Worm and the imprint it made on my brain, because rewatching it, I was like, oh my God, yes. Oh my God, yes. Oh, I forgot about this. Oh my God, she's so fucking fabulous. But as a kid, watching it, probably 25 years ago, I remember loving it. I knew that it was different. I knew that it was transgressive. I knew that it was perverse and deviant, and I loved her. So rewatching it was just so delicious. And I said to Michael, we were texting because we both rewatched it on the same night, and I said, God, it's even more bananas as an adult. I feel like it's more kind of shocking or effective now than maybe when I saw it back then, when I was absorbing as much content like this as possible. I think I didn't realize how, standalone Ken Russell is in terms of just his fucking sort of sick style, and just his bizarreness. So anyway, I'm glad that we rewatched it, but I wouldn't say that this is one of those movies that I've nurtured a relationship with. It's one that made an impression on me when I first saw it, and clearly an impression that was strong enough to literally inform a character in a new show I'm writing. So it lived in my brain. It burnt a hole in my dream. Oh my God, like there were things in this movie that I had put in the show that we're doing that I had forgotten were in this movie. Like her popping out of that basket. That's how this dance starts, right? I totally forgot I'm like, I just blatantly stole it. And these things, they live in your brain. Yeah. When you consume as much stuff as we do, they get stored away. So I'm so excited that we chose this movie because, clearly I needed to rewatch it.
Yeah, I was super excited when you guys suggested. Yeah, I think I came to it when I was about 9. I'd worked out that if a VHS at the store had the Vestron sign printed on it, then I'm almost definitely gonna love this movie. And I think I remember rewinding the last 20 minutes several times because I was obsessed with practical effects and prosthetics and animatronic monsters, and so that final act gave me life. But I don't think it was until I saw it about 10 years ago that I truly loved it and got that Ken Russell oddness that you were talking to. What about you, Michael? What's your relationship with this?
Well, as Peaches knows, I love Ken Russell. Ken Russell probably ranks in my top 5 favorite filmmakers of all time for the sheer fact that he is wildly transgressive and perverse and strange. And I've said this many times, but I think Ken Russell is one of the great queer filmmakers who just happens to not be queer as far as we know, because he engages with a queerness that I think makes some audiences uncomfortable, like the broader definition of queerness. And I always like that. He's willing to take folklore or rock music or the stories of composers and like inject this strange subversion that gives you the story but also gives you so much more. And I love Lair of the White Worm because I also grew up a Dracula nerd, so I read a lot of Bram Stoker. Now, Bram Stoker was sort of a hit or miss author. Like, Dracula was a real big hit and there were a lot of misses. And I would say that Lair of the White Worm as a novella kind of falls somewhere in between, but this sort of meeting of the minds, this Irish folklore meets Ken Russell's madness, I loved it. I've seen it more recently than Peaches had, but even every time I rewatch it, I'm just taken with how mad it is, like truly mad. Because when you look at some of his other films, like Tommy or Listomania or The Boyfriend.
Yeah, I was going to say The Devil's Old Estate. Yeah. You don't immediately know it's the same guy, but then it does have that sort of uncanny weirdness, I suppose.
Right.
That it'll do.
And it ratchets up as we go. It's sort of like Ken Russell slowly reveals himself. I almost view Lair of the White Worm as the movie itself is constructed around a fable, and it's sort of like, what if Uncle Ken sat us down with a storybook, but then he can't resist being Ken Russell before it's over,
Yeah. You get a real sense of the guy. I know Hugh Grant has spoken out about his time on the film, saying that, Ken Russell was often having a liquid lunch and would direct everybody in quite a Larry way. And there is something a little bit slurry about a lot of his work, which I think is what brings that uncanny and often unexpected angle. And, as an ex-drinker, I feel I can recognize that when I'm like, that's something in this part of the brain. Something's going on. Something's under the influence there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. One of the most glorious elements of this movie, though, is the comedy. And as we know, horror comedy, it's near impossible to get right. But Russell, he's very British, and the comedy is very British, and it weaves into it seamlessly. The gags and the one-liners in this aren't made a meal of. They're so conversational and non-disruptive to the flow of what is being said that there's almost a delay in catching up and going, that was a joke, and you kind of process it. What do you think about the comedy element in this? Do you think it works for you, Peaches?
I would say that there is maybe an awkward disconnect, and I think I love British comedy, so I don't necessarily think it's that. I think I'm definitely like an American who really, really connects with a British sensibility. In some ways, maybe even better than the average American sense of humor. I think British comedy tends to be more clever and a good mix of absurd and stupid with clever, which is totally what I love.
I'll say that.
And, yeah, I think that with this movie though, and Ken Russell in general, you've got this sort of man who does camp in this very specific way, where it's camp, it's outrageous, it's wild, but it's not necessarily queer. It's like this weird, I don't know what it is. It's unique to
I know
Ken
exactly
Russell.
what you mean.
And so I would say some of it works, but I think part of what attracts me to it is that a lot of it to me is slightly off.
Yeah.
It's slightly awkward. It doesn't quite hit the nail on its head. And I think in this movie, less so. It's less obvious than a movie like Tommy, where it's like, oh my God, let's have Anne Margaret roll around in beans or whatever.
Beans.
And you're
Yeah.
you're like, what
Well, I
is
suppose
happening?
in this, I suppose that it's the aeroplane dream sequence, which is just a farce, the
Right.
felt tip symbolizing the erection, and that even that comedy in that moment is so different to the comedy in the rest of it. It just feels very, very strange. What about you, Michael? Do you like the comedy in it?
I do, but I also think that it's because it's being handled by exceptional performers. And by that I mean Hugh Grant and Peter Capaldi are actors at the top of their game even then. I mean, like, around this time, Peter Capaldi, everybody knows him as the Doctor in this current generation. He's an Academy Award-winning person. He's been around forever. Hugh Grant, of course, is at the beginning of his career. And they both are really good at dry delivery. And Ken Russell exists in a world where weirdness is so common that dry is how you deliver it. And they are able to give. And of course, them matched against Sylvia, Amanda Donahoe's character.
Donahoe.
She's chewing scenery from the second she enters to the second she exits. So I think it's that delicate balance of Russell's direction and script with performers who know what they're getting into. And I think that if you sign up to be in a Ken Russell movie, you need to know what you're getting into, or otherwise you're going to get eaten up. Like, Kathleen Turner understood Crimes of Passion, and Margaret knew that she was going to get doused in baked beans, and they committed fully. You have to kind of commit fully to something like this.
Yeah, you have to know what you're in for, I suppose. So, yeah, well, you mentioned it then. We should talk about Sylvia, Amanda Donahoe in this. For me, this is where the true cult iconic element comes in and it's introduced, because I honestly think her performance, especially just rewatching it, is just, I think it's astonishing. And I don't know if you could get away with that kind of performance today. And the fact that there's no ambiguity about her being a villain gives her such a wide playground. Like, there's no slow reveal or kind of mounting suspicion. Is she the bad one? She's allowed to be immediately villainous and carry herself in such a way that she just demands this respect. Yeah, you will respect me or you'll be sorry. And there's even the moments of nudity, it feels completely in her control, and it feels powerful and demands respect rather than feeling exploitative and unnecessary. What about, you mentioned this, Peaches, that she blew you away, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just described is all completely true. And it's a performer who's in total control of their, agency, but for the character, but also their performance. Like, there isn't a hint of doubt. There isn't a hint of second guessing. It's like just that sheer confidence that makes this absurd performance just so wonderful to watch, and we believe in it, and we're it's that villain that we're rooting for because she's just so fierce and fabulous, and she just owns everything. She would win every ball competition because of that. Yeah, tens across the board, because she's got the style, she's got the body language, she's got the attitude, her line delivery, her dialogue, she just kills it. And again, you see this show up in Ken Russell movies, again and again. He does love to give women a lot of power, and a lot of agency, and to make them fierce and dominant. And that is so appreciated. I really like it. And I agree with you. It doesn't feel exploitative. She's not really the object of desire as much as she's the object of intimidation and awe,
Yeah. Yeah, good shout. What about you, Michael?
Well, I love this character. I agree with everything both of you are saying, because she's the one who elevates the movie. I think without her, this movie is not a cult classic. I mean, there's no question. But I also think that she really represents that perfect meeting of Russell and Stoker, because this is evil by way of seduction, or rather the seduction of evil. Because in a very similar way to Jonathan Harker showing up to Dracula's castle, from the moment he arrives that Dracula is a bad person, but there's that seduction of darkness where you're like, okay, but let's stay just a little bit longer because I want to see where this goes. The same thing from the second she arrives, when the cop is bit by the snake and she brings him in, in that glamorous outfit set against everyone else.
Iconic outfit as well. You're like, okay, this is camp.
But you love her. You love her. And that's all throughout. And she delivers that. So every time someone comes into her web, so to speak, even though we know it's going to end poorly for them and that she is a true villainess, she just delivers in such a way that they want to stay and we want to stay. And that's a very specific kind of villain. I also have to say, one of my favorite moments with her is when she brings the Boy Scout home and he starts playing on the harmonica and she just starts dancing, because she's just like a full body commitment. Because you want to talk about comedy, that to me, every time I see this movie,
she drops the CD.
Yeah, I start cracking up.
It's great. That is really a special moment. It gives me Jamie Lee Curtis in Truth. She's also brilliant at those throwaway one-liners. I think, when Hugh Grant says to her, do you have children? She just dryly says, only when there's no men around. And it's said as such a matter of fact, not like, here's a joke I'm setting up. And she has this wisdom, she feels like this ancient force in a modern world. And there's some of the imagery is just so genius, like her organizing a sacrifice and blaspheming God whilst using an 80s sunbed.
Yeah.
Is such a brilliant juxtaposition, this ancient evil with historical values using the most vain and self-indulgent modern tech. It's just sublime little hit on the nose there. What about our two? Yeah, you mentioned there our strapping young lads. We've got Hugh Grant This is pre his trademarks, stammering and spluttering, I think, and Peter Capaldi. I think they're great, but kind of, as you just said, it's just all about her.
Yeah,
she just commands it. And now that you've said that, without her, what would this movie be in other hands? I mean, I believe Tilda Swinton was originally either asked to or cast in it, and that would be such a different vibe.
Yeah.
Because it's a different kind of camp, that. But Amanda Donahoe, she was such a star. I've actually worked with her. I did a cult TV series called Bad Girls, set in a women's prison, which is a British TV, and I was in a couple of seasons of that. And she came in really late on in season 8, I think it was the last season. And she had that energy on set, but the thing is also she didn't have a very happy time on that show. She wasn't too happy about being there. So, her character was the warden, playing the warden, so she was the one that everyone hated. But also, I think she'd had a rough time with producers or some sort of. I don't know the details of it, but her presence in the building was very much this. And so I do think she brought a lot of herself to this, having been in a room with her. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of definitely fun to know, just sort of like that performer who is, I think a lot of us who make content, definitely if you're like me, you're casting someone because some truth you see in them speaks to the character you're trying to illustrate. And so, I always find that people are most really, I think really good actors do have traits from their characters in some ways, and especially a character as iconic as this, she had to she brought that from someplace, that's
Right.
within her, and obviously that's a fierceness and a self confidence, just to sort of, well, I mean, I think it's flawlessness of her performance that is why we as queer people, look at someone like Amanda Donahoe and Lair the White Worm and identify more with her than the good quote unquote people. Like, as a drag performer, it's like, to me, it's like that movie is only about her. She's who I want to be. That, she's just amazing. And
it is drag. It is drag.
It's
that
totally
whole
drag.
performance.
Speaking of which, I have a really funny coincidence, just like the coincidence of creating a show right now where I have a snake woman in the show, and
Right.
didn't directly connect it to this movie, which is ridiculous. I had dinner last night. I mentioned with my friends from, or maybe I didn't mention it on air, but my friends from London, one of whom is a writer, and he writes about film, and he's a film student, but he wrote a book about James Bond, and he's written a book about Spielberg, and he's fabulous gay film writer. So I'm telling him about how awesome Lair the White Worm was, rewatching it, and then he tells me that his instructor in grad school was none other than Ken Russell, and I'm like, well, I need to know everything.
Right.
So the tidbits that I can share with you, I'm guessing I'm allowed, are who cares?
Go for it.
Yet another cease and desist.
I just basically euphemized and said Amanda Donahoe's a bitch. So
You did, and I thought you did that quite well. Anyone in the film industry knew exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
But he said that Ken does like to drink, and many of their sessions were at a pub. That he was super lovely, very kind of unassuming, like had no airs about him. Was kind of
nice.
In many ways comfortable being just pretty simple, I guess you'd say. Showed up to be in their student films, was really like really, and at this point he's very accomplished, successful filmmaker who enjoyed teaching these students. But of course I had to say, like, well, is he at all queer? And because I do think that there is this level of camp and his obsession with dicks and phalluses and all these things that we haven't even talked about yet, but tend to show up in his movie in a very sort of specific way that you don't see in other filmmakers' work necessarily. And his reaction was, well, I don't know. It was like, I said, so the verdict is out. He's like, I don't know.
It wasn't a
yes and it wasn't a no. So I thought it was an interesting,
Well, I mean,
take. Not that it matters.
But it is interesting because Ken Russell did surround himself with a lot of queer people as well. I mean, Derek Jarman, famously one of the greatest gay filmmakers of his generation, built the sets for The Devils. That's like a Derek Jarman vision. It's funny. My dear friend Andrew, who also is the cinematographer of a lot of my films, he's close with Ken's son, Rupert. And so I've also gotten some pipelines of the Ken of it all. And Ken just seemed to be like addicted to whimsy and weirdness. One of the things that I find really interesting is that Ken Russell was very much against garden gnomes. He hated them. So his widow, for one of his birthdays, commissioned an artist to create a garden gnome that looked just like him. And it's currently here in Andrew's apartment in LA, and we've put it in most of the short films that I've made, as well as we shot a short film on Super 8 that we haven't released yet of just Ken going around downtown Los Angeles. But it's a freakish garden gnome that looks like Ken Russell. And it's because he was like obsessed with garden gnomes, but also was a little afraid of them. And that's why it exists. Right. So he was just weird.
Right. Yeah, so that's the same as me. That's because clowns and sharks terrify me, but they're the films I gravitate to if they're going to be the antagonist in them. So it's one of those things. But the third act of this, talking about things that terrify me, it takes a bit of a turn, doesn't it, don't you think? And I think the tone slightly changes. And then we get our it's much more 80s Western, scary.
Yeah.
Turns into a scary movie. I genuinely jumped at the mother when she's watching the TV. And actually, a lot of those visuals, it feels very theatrical, don't you think? Some of them, it feels like you're watching a play on stage sometimes, I think, like a two-hander. And it feels very British. But this whole final act, because this is the stuff I loved when I was a kid, what do you think of this? And obviously, yeah, we've got some sharp wooden cocks in there as well.
I mean, I have to say that the third act was, I had not remembered it as well as I had remembered the rest of the movie, interestingly enough. And I think in some ways, and I don't know if it felt this way at the time, but rewatching it, I felt like it tried to do too much in some ways, and I wish it had exercised. The rest of the movie, to me, has more restraint. As far as, and maybe that's intentional, like he was saving it for the grand finale, but I wish that the film had carried that sort of level of restraint all the way through the third act and lessened sort of the absurd and ridiculous. It just almost turned into another movie for me.
Right.
Completely.
And so I would say that that's really the if I'm going to be critical of any part of the movie and say this is what doesn't hold up, and that's my point. I don't remember if it held up then for me, but I know that for now and by today's standards, that worm looked like something we might have at the Terror Vault. You know what I mean? Like it was not.
They actually used the bonnet of a VW Beetle for it.
Oh really?
Yeah.
That's why it's got that shape. It's so good.
That's genius.
See, that's so funny though, because for me, it's almost a payoff, all of that shit, because it's so ridiculous. What, you don't need to have his eye poke through the back of his head from a sundial. You don't need to have a hand chopped off. All this shit, and I love that. And there's no explanation of why some people turn into snakes, some people get paralyzed. It doesn't try and round everything off. It just suddenly goes stratospheric, and I feel like that was on his, fifth beer. This whole
yeah.
What about you?
Feels like
what about you, Michael?
Well, it goes back to what I said at the beginning about the construct of this movie specifically. It feels like for the first two acts, Ken's reading us a folk tale, and then he can't help but be Ken Russell. I think that all of the Ken Russell, I mean, there are things throughout, of course, the vivid green screen imagery of the nuns at the feet of Jesus and stuff. But this is when he's just like, all right, script over my shoulder, let's get nuts. And it feels completely unhinged. Peaches is correct. I mean, this does go into a territory that could very well have been another movie. I mean, because we're talking about strange folklore and, a old legend. And next thing we know, Hugh Grant's putting subwoofers on his roof to play music, to enchant snake people. And then next thing there's moms getting cut in half and they're down. Who knew she had all that in her house? I love that, the whole gag of that she was able to avoid this as she just put earplugs in. I mean, it just kind of felt like, what all can we throw in?
Again, though, that's her, like the sunbed, that's her utilizing modern inventions. I found a way to get through these things they already make, and they're called earplugs. It's great. I love that. And also that, I mean, it's an image I think that you don't forget, but when she turns fully into this sort of blue-grey version of Sylvia, it feels like a Ray Harryhausen creation to me. There's something very classic about that ending with the, that it's like the Temple of Doom style. We're in a cave and it has that Harryhausen vibe, and the giant beetle. Beetle. I mean, it was a VW beetle, but it's a worm snake dragon. I love it. For me, it ramps up, and the extra star on a 3-star movie turns to a 4-star because of the ending for me. And then of course there's this final stinger when we find out that they were given the wrong anti-venom, which is great.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah. I mean, I would say this. I would totally agree with you that part of what makes it a Ken Russell movie is the third act, right? And so maybe in a way, part of my issue is that while I love Ken Russell, there's still part of me that like he's not my favorite filmmaker. And
Right.
you know, I do enjoy his movies, but somehow they don't come together for me the way that other like sort of over the top, absurd filmmaking. I don't know how to describe it, but I totally get what you're saying, and I agree that if you're settling in for a Ken Russell movie, the third act is what is the payoff with Lair the White Worm. But I do enjoy the restraint of sort of the movie, and then the end is just kind of balls to the wall, nutso bananas. I mean, that's what Michael and I were texting to each other, like, oh my God. And I was actually finding myself, I'm glad that you brought it up, trying to go back in the movie and go, okay, like, if she bites them and they become vegetative, I'm like, okay, so the boy, the Cub Scout or whatever, like, she drowned him, so that's why he didn't turn into a snake. You know, I found myself trying to figure it out, right? And but, you know, it's a wild movie. And the other thing that I thought was interesting was my take on that scene with the Cub Scout, because in the U.S. Right now we have a movie out called Leave No Trace, and it's about the pedophilia that's been allowed to exist in the Boy Scouts, you know, amongst scout leaders. And so Boy Scouts in many ways are symbols of childhood and symbols of, you know, so I was watching that character and like looking at his costume going like, I don't get it. Do they have Boy Scouts in England? Like, how old is this boy? Like, how old are we supposed to think he is, you know?
Yeah, it is a bit of an uncomfortable moment, I have to say.
Like,
and
you don't know,
it doesn't
right?
sit quite right with me. Also, it's very odd because he's broad Cockney, but we're actually in Yorkshire, and the accent's all odd, so it just feels like this child that they brought in from elsewhere and made him do something. And apparently the young actor was originally meant to go full frontal nude, and when she stands him up, you were going to see this young boy completely nude, but he it's not that they decided that's too much, he bottled it on the day, and so it's very interesting, is it, because she's such an anti-hero and you're so behind her and you kind of want her to win and be evil and do all her dastardly things, but then it's really problematic what happens there. Don't you think?
I think that also that is included to remind you this is a villain. There is that thing sometimes we get too comfortable in horror where we celebrate our problematic fave horror villains. And I think every now and then filmmakers like to remind us, no, I know you like this person and there's an allure, but remember this is the bad guy. Like you're still supposed
bad,
to...
yeah. I don't know, I love evil. I'm all about evil.
Yes, exactly. There you go.
Lovely.
Perfect.
But is there anything else you want to say about this? Anything we've missed, or any burning desires?
Oh, well, I will tell you, I was thrilled to reveal to Peaches. I mean, not thrilled because this is an unfortunate chapter of this person's life. But for folks who don't know, Catherine Oxenberg, who plays Eve, who gets kidnapped. Catherine Oxenberg, who did, of course, go on to be on Dynasty and Acapulco Heat. She is most known to modern audiences as like one of the key people who brought down NXIVM. Did you know this? Like the whole NXIVM thing?
What?
Yes.
One of my favorite cults.
Yeah. No, her daughter was one of these people that was brought in by Keith Raniere, and they had like a divide. And she, like, if you go and watch that, she's in all of the documentaries about it because she's like the mom who was like, something's wrong here. And she kept pushing and pushing, and she found a way, because she like at least had some influence to get people to respond to her. And so, yeah, she's like a key factor that brought that story public. So I just think it's interesting. Wow. Like if you want to draw a parallel, at the beginning of her career, she's in a movie about being kidnapped by this cult leader. And then later she breaks up a real life cult. So
that's amazing.
I think the only other thing that I want to mention is that was something I was trying to text to Michael, but I didn't know how to say it. But I find Sammy Davis's performance in this movie to be so bizarre. Yeah. And like I don't know what, and maybe you can help, Stevie, maybe you can help let me know, like what is that accent, and like is it an affectation? Is it an accent? Like she's talking, I can't do it.
Right.
Like,
so
I don't know.
It's as soon as the film starts, you're like, oh, this is jarring. Yes. And even as a British person. So it's what I like to call BBC Northern, which means it is so unspecific, but it is above the M25. So that means that it could be Derbyshire, it could be Yorkshire, and there's this on when you get period dramas. British period dramas, you always get BBC Northern. So, oh, missus, I don't know what to do. Oh, should I go and fetch the water? And they all have this unspecific Northern accent. And that's what she's doing. It's bizarre and it's unplaceable. Okay. But also, I feel like a lot of it was redubbed.
It was.
Yeah,
That's the other thing that adds another layer to it.
Right.
Okay, so I'm so glad. I feel so validated because I'm watching it, and of course, as someone who goes to England a lot and performs in England a lot and loves British stuff, I was watching it going, "What the hell is going on?" And then the layer on top of that is that the dubbing her specifically, like it's almost like poor thing didn't understand Foley and that the words had to go into her mouth, so you've got that weird kind of like kung fu thing happening
that
where
disconnect,
you know, so it's a multifaceted issue. I will say this though,
strange.
I loved it. Like it's the kind of weird shit that like, anytime she was on screen, I was like, okay, what is she gonna say now? You know,
it's funny because when I watched it, I scribbled down some notes, and this will mean something to only a small percent of the audience, but I was like, this girl has Big Finish audio voice. Like she was very specifically like. For, you know, Big Finish being that they do all the Doctor Who and, you know, all these like original audios over there where it's just like a bunch of audio performers. And it is like she's just so pronounced in comparison to everybody else. And because it's overdubbed, it just makes it even more so.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things about overdubbing is when they have to dub a moment of emotion or action, which obviously you can't quite get the same feeling when you're stood just in a booth trying to match it, and it never quite fits. And there's a whole moment in the kitchen where she kind of has this quite panicked speech because she's had the visions of the nuns and all that, and it's so and it's dubbed over it, and it's uncanny. It's like very strange, and with you, Peaches, it's like one of my favorite things about it. And something I love about B movies, that's one of my favorite things, is when you can see the loose ends and the threads, and you're like, this is very strange. This does not make a good movie. I love it.
I'm so glad that I got to bring it up because it's just one of those weird things that I almost felt uncomfortable saying because am I the only one? But it sounds like I'm not.
Why aren't we talking about it?
Yeah. Good.
Thank you both so much. And and it was you that actually suggested it, and it's such a brilliant suggestion because I think it lands in both of our camps with the sort of the slightly trashy B-80s, but also very much it's what we would call a cult film for sure. And I hope we're introducing some people to it because I know when I've announced recently that this was coming up, and some people saying, "Oh my God, that's one of my favourites, so British," and some people saying they've never heard of it. So we're doing the Lord's work here.
We are, and I'll say it again. Rewatching it, it is fabulous. I mean, it really is fantastic, and clearly, as a young person, absorbing as many movies as I possibly could, it's just really cool for me to see that the imprint this movie left on me overtly informed a show that I'm working on at the moment, and I would not have connected the dots as well if we hadn't done this podcast, because rewatching the movie, I'm like, I just wrote a whole scene that's stolen from Lair of the White Worm, not realizing it. So I hope people do discover it and watch it. And, you know, I mean, British drag queens should be doing Amanda Donahoe.
Oh my gosh, it's iconic. Coming out of that
the whole thing,
sort of basket thing.
And it's not just her fabulous snake persona, which is just gorgeous and amazing with the body paint and, you know, the image they use on the poster, but just her even like her Robert Palmer backup dancer, you know, slicked hair and the 80s makeup. And I mean, that scene where she's sitting in the tree. Oh my God.
Oh, yes.
You know,
literally the serpent in the tree to Eve.
To Eve, exactly.
Okay, that's a bit on the nose. Come on.
Oh, that's the other thing we could say about this movie is there's nothing subtle about it.
No.
So
the iconography and all that.
You know, any other filmmaker might like have, you know, a worm in a shot that you don't really notice. They wouldn't necessarily create a whole scene where people are stuffing worms in their mouth and eating them as if it's some delicacy. And, I love the use of like hoses and, it's just, it's so, he's so...
The life jacket straps, everything is just like a worm.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I really like him. It's one of the reasons that I am attracted to Paul Verhoeven, too. He is a filmmaker of excess. Subtlety is not in the canon of Ken Russell, and you are either on board for it or you're not.
Very, very, very true. That's it on the nose. And what can you tell us about what's coming up with Midnight Mass? Is there anything you can tell us about? Because I love it so much.
Oh, thank you. I mean, right now we are the issue we have, which I know podcast creators can relate to, is that we put a lot of work into each episode and they take a lot of time, and then we sort of commit to this weekly schedule. And so the last season, I forget how many episodes we put out, but it was a lot, and it was getting to be harder and harder and harder to keep up with our other schedules. So what we're doing now is taking a little bit of a break and working on season 3. We're pre-producing season 3, kind of getting it together. And the tough part is that we're going, both Michael and I, our busiest season of the year is coming up. So, we don't have a specific date yet, but we're looking at, sometime this fall, season 3 will kick in, and it'll be more of the same, but just new titles and new guests.
I can't wait for one. But thank you both so much. It's probably lunchtime there now, and it's nearly bedtime for me. Well, no, not quite. But no, since I'm sober, I barely see midnight anymore. But
you and I are both sober,
right? Oh yes.
And anyway, I'm glad that we have that in common.
And where can people find you and Midnight Mass?
Well,
I don't mean give out your address.
You can come to my home.
Yes.
I am on the social media platforms and have a website, peacheschrist.com, and Midnight Mass is available hopefully wherever you would listen to a podcast. So I think that would be easy enough. And Michael?
Yes, if you want to find me in person, please also go to Peach's home. No. I am
under my bed in a little crate with a padlock on it.
I am on Twitter and Instagram at Michael Varrati, just my name, and as Peaches alluded to, Midnight Mass is on Twitter as well at Midnight Mass Pod, as well as when we do release episodes in season, it's every Wednesday at midnight.
Amazing. Thank you so much, and hopefully see you next season for even more.
Yes,
please.
And Stevie, I will be in London December 3rd performing. Bringing my Christmas show to get this. The Royal Albert Hall. So if you're in London, check out the Royal Albert Hall website. They've just announced it. So.
Oh wow! I'm there.
It's a once in a lifetime. It's a once in a lifetime thing, as you know. Like they're gonna have me there, and they will never have me back because you just wait to see what I do.
I'll put a link down below so people can get tickets.
Okay, perfect.
Amazing.
Thank you
both.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And there we have it. Thank you once again to the incredible and amazing Peaches, Christ and Michael Varrati. What an honour. And what absolutely gorgeous guests. I had the best time. Next week, we're digging a little deeper into the bargain bin and discussing 1984's Blood Theatre from writer-director Rick Sloane. And returning by popular demand is the hilarious Tori Alan Martin. I think Blood Theatre is currently streaming on Plex for free with ads. Don't quote me on that, but it was last time I checked. If not, I believe it's also on that other tube, that other video site where you watch things. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give Brain Rot a quick rate and or review. It really helps the podcast get noticed, and it helps to bump us up on lists on the Apple iTunes. The Apple iTunes, I sounded like my mum. The internet, the Apple iTunes. So we can find other potential rotters. It only takes 1 minute, and it would mean the world. Come and find me and chat shit on socials. On Twitter and Letterboxd, it's Stevie's Brain Rot. On Facebook and Instagram, it's Brain Rot Pod, or email me, steviesbrainrot@gmail.com. Or as I said, Patreon, come and get your bonus content. It's patreon.com/steviesbrainrot. Also, very soon, some new merch dropping, and it's very exciting. But that's all I'm going to say for now. Until next time, Rotters, toodles!